Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. For new listeners, welcome. For our longtime listeners, you'll notice this is a bit of a unique format with a very special guest. I'm joined by Jason Paul, an attorney, political strategist, and candidate for chair of the Democratic National Committee. Jason has a remarkable background from leading campaigns across New England to authoring Trench Warfare, Politics in the Tinder Era, which I want to know more about that. Many of you have told us you want to hear directly from insiders about challenges and opportunities within the political system, and we're excited. I mean, I can't tell you how excited I am to have Jason here to share some of that expertise with us. So, Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an excellent topic. It's really hard because on the one hand, you're completely right that we are overloaded with outrage. On the other hand, on a day like this, hard not to be outraged. So I'll do my best.
Right. I mean, I do talk to people about that, like outrage is an okay thing. Like maybe sometimes we should be more outraged, right? But there's also this idea of kind of just swimming in it isn't necessarily effective, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for listeners, I just want to say that on Jason's website, he lists a number of his policies in his role. That's in his role as the DNC Chair candidate. And Jason may not be happy about this, but I wasn't going to go over all those one by one, but I do want to make sure I let listeners know about that. And the website for that is paulfordnc.com. Do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely. And no, I think that, I want to broaden the discussion to the things that, your listeners and listeners care about. There's the DNC election. It's 448 members. It's a lot of issues that are esoteric to those DNC members. Various ratios between elected members and at-large members and what committees they should get and all those things. And, while I'm very conversant in that now, before I got into this race, I wasn't that conversant in it. And I will say that in general, the issues of like why we lost the election, what does the media landscape look like? I would much rather talk about that than how many canvassers you need in which field offices, which is all very important stuff. But always to the audience. So don't worry about that at all. Paul for DNC. If you think I sound smart, you think you want to be helpful, paulfordnc.com, and that will answer all that. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of the fun.
Yeah, and I want to say that I definitely have some listeners that would just love that sort of, wonky sort of just get down in the weeds, right? But
they can write me and I will write back.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So yeah, Jason's contact information is right on the website too. And I was very shocked actually. My wife gets full producer credit for this because she sort of turned me on to some of the stuff you've said. And I told her, well, I'll reach out to him. He's not going to answer me. And then I got like an answer back really quickly. And I thought, well, that's got to be like an automatic, auto reply thing saying, thanks for reaching out. We'll get back to you in whatever time. But it was actually you. It was amazing.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, in this race, I got to be a responsive candidate or I'm going to be a dead candidate. So,
yeah, well, that's a good attitude. Yeah, Jason's also got his book I mentioned and also a Substack, which is actually quite interesting. So I'll make sure all those links are in the show notes.
Thank you very much.
So, and by the way, I know that you have media issues. So if as we're going through this, you feel like I'm just not getting this right and asking the wrong questions, feel free to bring that up.
No. Okay, my media issues are not with most podcasters or not with most journalists. My media issues are with sort of the politicization of political journalism. It used to be bad. It's now political journalism has never been the best part of journalism, and it's always been horse racy and kind of shallow. Politico has made it horse racier and shallower. And the bottom line is that when you have a debate between DNC chair candidates and your primary goal is to get them to say something bad about the sitting Democratic president, and that's like your mission, and when they won't give you what you want, then you're mad at them, that's no good. But that doesn't mean that most journalists ask good questions. It's not the media is in writ large terrible. It's just a lot of the political journalism is very gotchy. But no, I'm never I listened to your whole I listened to the 2 episodes of your show, and you were asking good questions, and I'm not gonna. Don't worry, you're not in for the Politico treatment. I promise you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And if people want to look online, you can listen. It was like an 8 hour video of that whole session.
That 8 hours was because they did all of the candidates for all of the offices. So the chair debate is only an hour and a half, mercifully. I don't think I could do 8 hours, but when you have 14 candidates for vice chair, they have to break it up into two vice chair segments, 7 apiece. And then there was the treasurer and the vice chair for something else and secretary, and that's how you end up at 8 hours. But the forum is just good. And I will share with you, um, my team put together the 10 minutes that are just me, so that if you are excited to just see what I had to say at the forum, I can send that off to you, and you can put that in the show notes as well.
Oh,
So
that'd be perfect. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. So, going on from what you were just saying there about, adequately covering, Biden's accomplishments. I mean, I guess, acknowledging that the media isn't a propaganda machine and it's not really supposed to be a mouthpiece for the government. I'm curious what you think, the media could or should have done differently related to that.
well, I think in general, the media started to get an emotional feeling that people were not happy with the economy. And when they got that emotional feeling that people were not happy with the economy, they began to build that into all of their questions. So in the piece I wrote following up the forum about the Politico Forum, I talked about Dana Bash's question, the second question that in Kamala Harris's first interview, the one that she did with Walls. Dana Bash asked, "What are you going to do on your first 100 days? What do you want to do?" That's a great question. And then she asked, "But people are not feeling the economy. What do you say to those who don't feel the economy is good?" And that sort of that baked into that question, baked into the sort of the key question, is the economy good or not? The sort of the feelings the economy was bad were baked into a lot of the journalist questions throughout the entire process. The economy is bad. What are you going to do about it? Not sort of, you know, the economy is either, a lot of your previous guest on one of the shows was like, "Oh, well, the economy is really good. I don't know why people are so upset." And then the post-election show is people, "We really lost because of the economy." And I think that frame that the economy was like bad carried through in a lot of the questioning. So the questions were predicated on that premise. And I think that to a large degree, that premise is not super good. And I think this is basically one of the core how you deal with the Trump era in journalism and failures, is that 33 to 40% of the country thought that Trump won the 2020 election. There is no basis in any fact for the possibility that Trump won the 2020 election. If anything, if there's it's back on a Newsroom, they joked about the TV show Newsroom, they joked about how there might really be a Bigfoot if you really look at it. There's more likely to be a Bigfoot than there is for Trump to have won the 2020 election, because he had $300 million to find out whether he won the election. He had the Justice Department looking into whether he won the election. He had, a whole giant, massive apparatus that if there was any fraud to find, they would have found. And they found basically nothing. So when you started off at the beginning of this whole process, the beginning of Biden's term, you had at least a third of the people who, based on nothing factual, were predisposed to loathe, despise, hate, and be against anything he wanted to do. You know, they were chanting, the joke, "Let's go, Brandon." I'm not going to say what they were actually chanting, but the joke was "Let's go, Brandon" was right at the beginning of the Biden administration. term. That sort of negativity that existed amongst that portion of the population will feed into questions about, is the economy good or not? Because those people were never going to say the economy was good, except now we're going to have the exact same economy, and those people are going to say the economy is great. You're going to
Right.
have to ask them right now, and the economy is fantastic. The economy's never been better. I don't know what you're talking about. The economy is awesome. So when framing the question of how is the economy doing or not doing, the press bought into a negativity frame. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues that, inflation didn't hurt people's pocketbooks. It doesn't mean that everything was perfect. The sort of core struggles of ordinary Americans were not fixed by the Biden administration. They weren't fixed by the Trump administration. They weren't fixed by the Obama administration. Sort of the hollowing out of the middle class has been an issue since Reagan, and nobody's really, you know, stemmed the tide. There were the Clinton administration moved things in the right direction. The Obama administration moved things a little bit in the right direction. Trump. The thing about the Trump administration that I say that almost no one else does is that the Trump administration continued the Obama economic policies because he couldn't get his own economic policies except for the tax cuts and more spending because he needed the sequestration to go away, which was both military and non-military. So ultimately, but that hasn't ended, but it didn't get dramatically worse. I think a lot of people, if you talk about, their economic conditions, is the job that I get and the wages I earn, that's stuff that I did. And the prices that I go to pay, that's stuff that Biden does. But if the summer before this election, we had the most travel check-ins at airports ever. So the behavior of people was not screaming, we're economically real, we're the worst, this is the worst it's ever been. And one of the things in the exit poll that I look at is, okay, so they asked the question about what you think the economy is doing. And 32% said it was excellent or good, and they voted for Harris by 90 to 10, basically. And then they asked, the people who said it was poor, and they voted for Trump 90 to 10. And then you go to the group in the middle who said not so good, and they voted for Trump by 6. So it's very clear to my mind that a lot of people's perception of the economy was related to their political preference, not the other way around. And but the journalists accept at face value that people are broadly unhappy about the economy, then they ask frames that say that the economy is bad, and the broad frame of the economy is bad was the frame that people had. And so when you ask them whether it was bad or not, they mostly thought it was bad, although they didn't think it was depressionary, except for the 33%. But again, one of the things about that 33% is what other things do they believe partisanly that they believe the economy is poor, and they would probably also, be incredibly likely to be white evangelical Christian because that's Trump's base, and he won them 82 to 17. And if you don't pull out those little kernels, then you get into a frame where the economy is bad. And then, so that would be where I would fault them. But it's not, I agree, it's not the press's job to everything is wonderful, but sort of basic, the poll that I cited on the Substack they asked 5 basic questions of the public. Is inflation currently up or down? It was down. People thought it was up. People who knew it was down were intending to vote for Harris by 40 points. Whereas the stock market, if you knew it was up, you voted for Harris by 20 points. If you thought it was down, you voted for Trump by 9. Border crossings, same deal. So on the actual factual basis, if you knew the right answers to the factual questions, you voted for Harris, sometimes by 40 points, sometimes by 20 points. If you got the answers wrong, you voted for Trump. Now, it is completely the case that a lot of people who did that had tuned out the mainstream media or legacy. The traditional media is probably the phrase I want to use. Mainstream sounds like an attack. Legacy sounds like a done. Traditional media. People tuned out the traditional media were way more likely to get the answers wrong and therefore vote for Trump. But the coverage overall was just slanted just enough so that it wasn't, you could read stuff and be confused. I'm like a big fan, like the stock market is the perfect one for this because it's not an ambiguous, the stock market has a number, the numbers are always the same. Now, I know the stock market's not the economy. I've never thought the stock market is the economy, but I assure you, if the numbers go up under Trump, Trump's going to say it's the economy. And if the numbers go down, then he's going to talk about something else. But the so that would be that is my main fault there.
Well, I'm sure if I had a Republican strategist on, they'd almost make the 180-degree shift argument, right? That they never reported Trump's accomplishments very well. How do you see that? I mean, do you think that same courtesy should be extended to Republicans? And sort of how do you see that balancing act, and
What
kind of playing out?
what I would like in terms of accomplishments, and this is the thing the press does horribly, left, right, center, whatever, all the time, is how do you successfully sort of do blame or credit for things? And how do you make sure that's aligned with what the person says and is trying to do and not just sort of the you're on a river and you follow the course of the river? So what I mean by that is, you know, Trump doesn't deserve very much credit for Trump's economy in the first 3 years because Trump continued Obama's policies, but for the extension, but for increased spending, which people like, and tax cuts, which people like. But if you're so putting, basically, people are happy with you if you put more stuff on the credit card. It doesn't mean that you're like doing anything good. But if you went off what his budgets were proposed, what he wanted to do, the budgets that he proposed would have caused untold misery. It's just they were never real to anyone because the Republicans did not come close to having the votes to bring their policy agenda to fruition. So because the Republicans didn't have the votes to bring their policy agenda to fruition, Trump's economy was Barack Obama's economy. And actually, President Obama started to say this a little bit in the campaign, but never, you know, things you say a little bit now don't exist. It's only things you say 2 million times. And sort of at the time, the Democrats didn't brag about this because their basic attitude was if we brag about this, Trump is going to blow it up because if he has to live with the fact that it's not his, it's ours, it's Obama's, then he'll just veto it on pettiness. And we didn't have confidence that we couldn't veto it on pettiness, so we just we took the wins, we got the Obama budgets, and we kind of smiled our way all the way to an 18 midterm. But because we sort of behaved that way, and look, at the time it's harder to judge because so sort of where I will give Trump actual, so going on your question, is where I will give Trump actual credit. Um, on Operation Warp Speed, he got out of the way and really was pushed great to get a vaccine much faster than we usually get a vaccine. Um, on COVID, he mostly let the public health people do what they want. He whined about it a lot and made it look and retroactively now he hates it and is terrible, wish he never done it, but he mostly let the public health people do what he wanted. Whether it was probably good that he got Soleimani, although I don't know where our relationship with Iran would be if he hadn't, but that was probably good. So there are some okay things that he did, but you also have to sort of judge against what did he want to do that he couldn't do? And that's the fear that I have going forward is now he's going to get to do more of that. And that is terrifying. Um, but sort of the finding a way to actually assess blame versus not blame, and so going back to sort of back all the way to the 2014 midterm election, which is like a thing I'm obsessed with. So the Republicans shut down the government for literally no reason. They said, we want to repeal Obamacare, but we just had an election in 12 that was about whether or not we were going to repeal Obamacare. And the people voted to keep Obama and Obamacare. And they said, okay, we're going to shut down the federal government because we want to repeal Obamacare. And it was shut down for like 2 weeks. There was no reason for it. It was pointless and mean, and it hurt people and accomplished nothing. And then in theory, the Republicans were going to take blame for that. But then the Obamacare website didn't work for 3 weeks. And because the Obamacare website didn't work for 3 weeks, that was the news story. And one is like conscious effort to do things that people don't want is against the will of the public and shutting down the government for no reason. And one is sometimes tech is harder than we'd like. And we're sorry about that. But sort of one was like commission and one was sort of some degree of slight neglect. And I'm not defending the rollout of the Obamacare website, but it is also the case that, in judging the politicians, which should you judge more for one? Another thing from 14, and this is like the election time forgot, but another thing from 14 is in the last 2 months, the media went into an absolute panic about Ebola. And one of the problems about the Ebola virus is it's really hard to be it doesn't spread very well. You really need to like be it's not as communicable. And we ended up with, I think, 2 US cases, no spread in US cases. The 2 US cases survived, like most of the US cases survived. I think there was one Ebola death. And you would think that Barack Obama had like poisoned everyone with the Ebola virus and we're all going to die. And Obama's administration did a phenomenal job handling Ebola, but they didn't convey to the press the level of freak out that the press wanted. And because they didn't convey the level of freak out that the press wanted, the press hammered him unceasingly on this. And, the way, sort of the way things work in a daisy chain, it is probably the case that the media's attitude about Ebola cost the Democrats 2 Senate seats, the North Carolina seat and the Colorado seat. Those 2 seats, if the Democrats won them, probably they would have been able to appoint Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court and not have the Republican blockade work. If the Republican blockade had never happened, then then the Supreme Court wouldn't have been on the ballot when Trump was in, and that there's a Supreme Court seat at stake was a crucial closing argument in an election Trump won by 77,000 votes. So each little thing leads into the next, and that's how you get there. And there was no basis for the Ebola freakout, none. Anyway,
So, you know, I know these are the kind of questions I know you're probably a little bit tired of, and they might be touchy with your candidacy, but in terms of you've talked about how the press kind of hammered Biden a lot and took the focus away from those accomplishments, but some of those concerns you could argue were valid, right? And we sort of saw the performance at the debate, so there were some questions about his fitness for another term. So I mean, how, I mean, do you think the media should avoid those kinds of things, even if they were maybe it was information voters should know, and how do they kind of find that balance?
here's the question that I would want the journalists who focused on this to focus on. What was the evidence that Joe Biden's diminished capacity, however you define it, was having an impact on the policies of the United States of America? If you could show Joe Biden is like too out of it, and therefore, you know, Sweden and Finland didn't trust us to go into NATO but they did trust us to go into NATO. And, or Joe Biden did this and then that led to that. But there is not a lot of question that the federal government under Joe Biden functioned at a very high level. So the question is, was it going to not function at a very high level if Joe Biden had another 4 years? Because then he would not have been able to do it. But almost no one has, for me, ever done a story. Joe Biden is out of it. Here are the consequences. And since there were never, to my mind, ever really any consequences,
Well, I think
it's
one consequence you could argue is, we look to these presidents as, um, I don't know, what am I looking for? The word of sort of just like a stand-in for sort of national, pride, or maybe none of these are quite the right words I'm thinking of. But I sort of think like, Reagan. A lot of people didn't really care what Reagan did, but he just looked good doing it, and 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 um and when some of those cases, like particularly the debate, Biden just doesn't look good. Like you're worried about the guy.
yeah, that's totally fine, and that's a valid concern. But the question is, now you get into scales because, if so, that's a valid concern with Biden. And if you had, I don't know, John Thune was the Republican candidate for president, then, you know, then maybe the scales balance in the other direction. But, you know, Trump says everything he says with incredible amounts of energy and vigor. It's just half of it is complete nonsense. The other half of it is just mean-spiritedness. He did, there were if you play he said the wrong thing cognitive error game, you could say the same things about Trump that you said about Biden.
That's
And
true. There was a lot
so,
of the word salad was never called out, right?
right. And so the point is that when you're, not to mention like, the, you know, that he was an adjudicated sexual assaulter. I
Yeah,
mean, that happened. That was adjudicated. Traditionally, like, I think the press did a lot of alleged, and, I think this press still casts doubt on that, even though it was adjudicated by a court, because one, they were a little bit afraid that Trump might sue and Trump might be mad, but also they didn't see that as their job. But when something is traditionally, when something is adjudicated by a court, that means that it's no longer a matter of, oh, he said, she said. It's like kind of that moves from he said, she said into a fact. And so, I mean, and I'm not, so are there valid criticisms? But let's, you know, you know, if he dropped dead, if he was sick, there was a vice president who could step in. There was no evidence that they were doing anything that was dangerous or wrong on these grounds. And it's worth weighing. And I agree that the debate was sort of really the debate was really bad. But one of the things is the debate was so bad that rather than, okay, bad debates happen, let's see how he performs, the press, the New York Times threw him out the plane the very next day. Right out the plane, get out of the race. And when the New York Times threw him out the plane, that was the end of it. There was all this sort of like, oh, it was George Clooney, oh, it was these leaders, oh, it was Pelosi. The reality is that when the New York Times threw him out the plane, that was the end. That was the end because the constant drumbeat of drip by drip by drip by drip by drip was too much. Now, do I think that at the end of the day, that was probably right and it was unrecoverable? Probably it was. But, you know, the level the level of things before that was so like primed on this, leaving a stack, go back and watch the State of the Union that he gave before the debate performance. If you go
right.
back and watch the State of the Union, you're not going to think, well, this guy can't possibly handle being president. I'm not I'm not saying that that isn't, I'm not saying that, so that's all I would say is that the scale and the size of it is what I would object to, but not sort of if the question is, was at this point Joe Biden potentially too old to have another term in terms of, I'm not like, how dare you say that? What a ridiculous thing to say. The press was mean to Joe Biden. Of course he was. It was a legitimate concern, but it's the size of the concern versus the size of the concern on the other side, which
Right.
they didn't make that size of the concern the same.
Yeah, you feel like a balance wasn't there. Well, I'm going to ask you this question, and I know it's probably one you hate the most, and I just want to get it over with so we can move on. So, because I hate talking about hypotheticals, I hate all this stuff, but I know a lot of people would love to hear your take on it. We're not seeing a lot of blame, directed towards Biden. And I kind of get it from a political perspective. That makes sense. But do you think that ultimately, his delay in withdrawing sort of hurt Democrats, and would it have been smarter to step down earlier?
I think that this is a vastly more complicated question than everybody
Yeah.
in the political universe involved in this. Now, retroactively, they all think that they're the geniuses of the world. But here's the basic. This decision needed to be made in January to February of 2023. Because if the decision is not made in January or February of 2023, there is no legitimate time for a presidential primary process. So you could say, well, we don't need a presidential primary process. We're just going to hand it off to the vice president. But that would not necessarily have sat well either. When you look at where things were at that time, the Democrats in November had won crucial races in in 270 in states representing 270 electoral votes, and in a lot of them in not small margins. They won the Michigan governor's race by 11. They won the Pennsylvania governor's race by, I think, 15. They won the Pennsylvania Senate race by 5. They won the Wisconsin governor's race by 3.5. All of them, all the candidates that were chosen by the Republicans had been Trump endorsed in the primary or Trump endorsed in the general MAGA candidates. They'd all been tagged with that. That's how they got there. They were all chosen that way. He endorsed them all. They all lost. The percentage of the electorate that voted in those was in the 80%. In Michigan and Wisconsin, it was 80% of the presidential. In Pennsylvania, it was 75% of the presidential. You look out at those voters doing those things with those stats, you think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to believe that you're going to be reelected, because you ran against Trump and that was the case. It turns out that those elections were somewhat of fool's gold, and had the Democrats lost all of those elections, then Biden may have been more easily pushed out, and more people would have said he would have pushed out. But you look at that map at that time, and you think, oh, geez, we are the best possible chance. We beat Trump once. We're the best possible chance to beat Trump again. And, one of the problems that the Democrats have in our primary processes is they push us a lot to the left, because a lot of the people in the activist base who make noise want commitments to things. And people make commitments that are not, a lot of the commitments that Kamala Harris half-heartedly made in the 2020 primary process were then used like a giant hammer to slug her over the head in this general election. So you have that. So you had all of that going on, the general tumult of this. And then you take ultimately what ended up happening is you then had, the potential for Gaza related problems. So the Harris voters ended up being exceptionally divided in the general election, on U.S. support for Israel. 43% of Harris voters wanted the U.S. to be less supportive. 11% wanted it to be more supportive. 9% didn't have an opinion. and 37% wanted the US to be as supportive. But you take that issue, you throw it into the primary, which is absolutely what would have happened, and you have a potentially really bloody primary fight that makes people unhappy and hard to reconcile to do that. With all that being said, since we lost, it's really hard to say, well, we would have lost by more, so we shouldn't have rolled the dice. But when those decisions were made, they seemed very reasonable and cogent and sensible. And so it's really hard to hindsight someone to death on that. And I think a lot of people in my race are like, well, we don't want to hindsight, but everyone's upset, so we're gonna say we don't want to hindsight, but we're not going to defend the decision. I'm willing to defend the decision a little because it made sense to me at the time as I was looking at the numbers. And, you know, and so when you say like, okay, we have inflation, well, inflation had decreased dramatically between when it was where it was in '02 and I mean in 22 and where it was in 24. So what changed what was it that changed the electorate's mind in those 2 years? Could have been part of it is there were a lot of people who entered the electorate who didn't participate in the election in 22, and more of them did. It might have been, frankly, that Trump very successfully was able to run what amounted to a pro-choice presidential campaign. Even though he promised the pro-lifers everything, his campaign was rhetorically very pro-choice, and that took some of the sting out of the abortion issue, which was not, the sting was not out of it before. But it is that combination of, you know, but that's where I am on that. I think it's a very close call. And I think that people who think it was an easy call are just, they're looking for someone to blame.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something about the primary, so I have something I wanted to ask about that, and I was going to do it later, but we might as well jump to it now. Which that this primary system kind of incentivizes, as you noted, representatives to focus on these primary voters who really only represent a small fraction of the electorate. Um, and so, what are your thoughts on that? Do you can you think of reforms, or have you thought of any reforms that could maybe address that?
It's a really, really complicated question because it's not it's not actually even the primary voters that are the drivers of this issue. Because the perception of where Democratic primary voters are is not the same as who wants to talk to you. So basically, who is it that is dying to talk to you during the primary process? It's your activist base. The activist base is the one that wants to come up with questionnaires and bring you to forums and convince you of the righteousness of their cause. And when you're competing in a primary process, they're often going to be the gate, they're going to gatekeep for you before you get to actually make a case to actual voters. And so, you know, I think you need to have a conversation with them about some need to be more humble. And I think that's very challenging because, they're not overly inclined towards that. And sort of, I'd say a one, but I think to some degree it's like we have to, when you're thinking about what you want to ask and what you want for, you have to at least a little bit ask that it's stuff that the general electorate can go along with. And I think one of the major problems in the in this space, and I'll talk about a group where a cause close to my heart, but has the same sort of core problem. You talk about sort of, I've heard a million times, you've probably heard it too. 90% of Americans support background checks for guns. 90% of Americans support more background checks for guns. Everyone supports them. The mean NRA is in the way. But then you have a referendum in Maine in 2018. Should we have background checks? Or no, maybe it was, sorry, I think it was 20. I don't want to, I don't,
Recently.
Recently, they had an election in Maine for background checks on guns, and the background check question failed like 53-47. Now, Maine might be a little bit more pro-gun than the country, though it's also more democratic than the country. It's certainly not more it's not uniquely anti-gun. That 90% number is what happens when you ask them in the abstract. When you and this is in trench warfare and the trench warfare politics in the Tinder era. But when you then focus the question on their mind, it doesn't become do I like background checks or not? It's do I like guns or do I not like guns? And if I like guns, I'll vote against this. And if I don't like guns, I'll vote for it. And it becomes that sort of level of binary. So a lot of times the left side will get polling that makes it seem like their issues are really popular. Another one I worked on in Massachusetts in 2022, we had a referendum to raise taxes on those making more than $1 million a year to fund public education and transportation. 4% surtax only on the amount of money over $1 million a year, paid for by basically that amounted to less than 1% of all Massachusetts taxpayers. We won the referendum like 52-48 in allegedly super blue Massachusetts. So initially, people want to raise taxes on the rich until you tell them, well, maybe it might someday be you because your house is worth more than $1 million, even though your house being it's worth more than $1 million. Once you do all the deductions and all the stuff, it's not going to be, you're not going to pay this tax. And if you do pay this tax, you'll pay like it's only on the amount over. So you'll pay worst case scenario, you pay the tax, you make $100,000 profit on your house, you pay four grand. You're not thrilled, but it's not like they take it, it's not. But the point is 52-48 in Massachusetts, bluest of blue, all blue states. A lot of times, I think third most in the Harris margin this cycle. A lot of times what the progressives think is really popular when it comes smack into when it's campaigned against, the numbers it doesn't hold up. And so, if you poll people on do they want Medicare for all, they say yes. If you poll them on do they want to lose their private health insurance, they say no. If you poll, and it's issue after issue after issue is like that, but then they'll take their poll in the one hand, the clout of their activist group in the other hand, and they will try and get Democratic politicians to make promises that don't play with the general electorate, but they have data that proves that it can. These are all wonderful, well-meaning people. I know when I get on my soapbox about this, I risk ruffling some feathers. They're all wonderful people. They all want what's best for people. It's just when you're trying to win general elections, you have to be a bit more sort of ruthless about what you're willing to commit to. And sort of one of the major things that used to happen all the time is because there wasn't video, because you couldn't edit video, huge degrees of what happened was a politician would tack left in a primary or right in a primary, tack back center in the general, and nobody would remember what they said or did in the primary. So they could just, it was Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney did this successfully. Mitt Romney said, oh, it's just like an Etch-a-Sketch. And people like lambasted him for that. But the truth is, in 12, he was able to make it work like an Etch-a-Sketch. He succeeded at that. But it's much harder these days to make things like an Etch-a-Sketch because there's so much ability to create, cut, edit, and immediately deliver video so that, and because of that, that is the challenge in the primary process is how do you get the groups to sort of not be maximalist in their policy demands because, one of the major things is, as the Biden administration should show very clearly, getting the politician to agree to your demands in the primary and then getting them elected when they then have to come up with what can get to 218 and 50 or sometimes 60. But if it's what, but even if it's just getting to 218 and 50, sometimes you have to jettison things that you really want to do and that your coalition wanted because that's where the math is. So getting someone to commit to great policy that can't become law because you didn't win enough elections, that, it's a harder conversation, but that's where it is. It's at that level. It's not actually at the voters level, because at the voter level, Joe Biden made an incredibly small number of those promises. And, they got down to the end of it. It was Bernie or Joe Biden. Everybody thought Joe Biden could win more. And he won the primary easily while making very few promises. But that's, to some degree, he could have the luxury of that because he started the race with national name recognition. And one of the problems is, how do you get a candidate who doesn't have national name recognition at the beginning of a primary process to actually win it at the end? And we have a really hard time doing that now. And that's challenging because the longer anyone knows about your existence, the worse your numbers get these days. It's not possible to stay known and popular for any period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got a couple more circling back to media stuff, if that's okay. Um, one of the things is this one's kind of more media and journalism at large, and we always think of them as this cornerstone of democracy. They have this duty as the fourth estate. But, in this modern world, we have a lot of challenges with sensationalism, polarization, this distrust in media is a huge issue. Um, and people don't seem to have a good sense of what journalism is, like the foundations of it. Like, we used to learn about the five W's, who, what, when, where, why. And where do you think people kind of lost sight of what journalism is? And is there a way to kind of bring back some of that trust?
You know, Journalism in America kind of had the same trajectory as like America in America. And what I mean by that is, after World War II, we were like it. Everyone else's industrial bases were destroyed. And so we had an incredible amount of run where we were a lot of the only game in town, and got exceptionally rich as a result of being the only game in town. But the Japanese and the Germans' industrial centers weren't going to be destroyed forever. Ultimately, the Cold War was going to end, and it wasn't as good as much anymore. And to a large degree, a lot of the value, a lot of the power of the American newspaper and then the American television station came, they were the dominant incumbent only game in town. And sort of once could become the case that you could get your quote unquote news from people who agreed with you and told you what you wanted to hear, a lot of people chose to then do that and not bother with sort of the traditional journalistic enterprise, because and then there was clearly a concerted effort on the part of the right to delegitimize mainstream journalism as a means of just working the refs to get a little bit of an advantage in elections. And somewhat understandably, the you know that was a reasonable strategy that I might have done too, had I been in their spot. And it is sort of that there might have been some, I don't think bias, but sort of some, you know the Democrats are culturally closer to us, and therefore we write stories that slightly reflect that. I think is valid. What the major problem that happens now is, you've got that went from basically, you know, I didn't like that call, or the refs can be unfair to us, to everything the refs do is a bunch of unimaginable lying. And one of the major problems is, to some degree, everything the refs do is lying. The actual facts that are the underlying argument of the underlying argument of the thing, those facts, because they're reported by journalists, become non-facts. So, and there's nowhere this is more true with all of the Trump stuff. That's sort of you know, how did, of all the things that he definitely did that now courts have said that he did, and, prosecutors have said what he did, all of that stuff gets thrown, initially you hear about it in the mainstream media or the traditional media, and then it's a lie because it was in the New York Times. It's a lie because it was in the Washington Post. And it's like, well, no, because it's just that's the place where people found out that fact, but it was still a fact, and it wasn't a fact because the New York Times said it was a fact. It was a fact because the court said it was the court said it was a fact. How do you get that all the way back? I mean, I think a large premise of my campaign is that you can't. And so Democrats need to adjust to the fact that you can't and build new things, both in the media space, but also potentially outside of the media space, because you need to have one person talking to another and you can't trust any filter beyond that. It's an expensive and complicated process. How do you get, I would think that if you wanted to start, the way you would really need to is, you know, new local, primarily online, but with some print copies, funded journalism that was nonprofit, but was able to be seen as above the fray enough that it could build trust before it got tarred with, a political feather. But one of the problems is, you know, getting someone who, you know, almost, this is where you get wealth concentration problems. So the kinds of people who can do this are the people who have, multi-millions or billions of dollars. And the people who have billions of dollars, when, they get a little, when they are worried about losing their defense contracts, get a little bit squirrely about, democracy dying in the dark. Well, now democracy can die somewhere else. Speaking of the Washington Post Bezos
Right. Well,
issue,
and the
but I'm
LA
saying
Times as well. Yeah. What are
LA
your
Times
thoughts on that? That it seems like that's a really bad sign for journalism.
I think it's a very bad sign for believing that billionaire owners can save you. But I think the question is, I think
Right. I mean, I've had people say, well, they expected Jeff Bezos to be essentially Rupert Murdoch for the left, right? And that didn't isn't what he but how it turned out.
right. I mean, he wasn't, because he didn't want to be. I, I think one of the major things, and this is on funding, on all these things, to a certain degree, what needs to happen at that elite level is this is like an amazing, and I don't know how this is working out, but I'm from West Hartford, Connecticut, and we had a kosher grocery store that was going to close. And everyone was really upset that this was like an institution in West Hartford. It had to stay open. And so basically all of the like 50 families who could afford it, like all bought in and like ran it as a consortium because it needed to be saved. And I don't know whether they took a bath on it or not in the end, but they were none of these people, like, nobody's losing their shirt because they all did it at like as a consortium level rather than like as a one person level. And I bring that example up because to some degree, if you want to save journalism, the country's sort of Jeff Bezosian billionaires can't own the thing by themselves outright, but if they owned the things, as a cooperative that is independent and they all put in their 50 million a year for the same thing, then it's harder for, Trump to be like, I'm going to go after all of you. And also sort of you don't feel like, you know, this is your this is your this is your tax for getting to be this rich and this powerful. But you can pay it at an amount, at a taxable level, not a ownership, this is my life level now thing. Because when you do it as a this is my life now, this is not where, you know, Jeff Bezos didn't want to be Rupert Murdoch wanted to be Rupert Murdoch of the right. Jeff Bezos wants to be the Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And then he thought, well, so I'll buy a newspaper. What's the harm? It'll be good. I can spend some money. But then he thought, oh, this business will work out. This will be profitable. And ultimately, it wasn't profitable. And people who build profitable empires don't decide, oh, okay, here's an unprofitable thing. I'm going to keep propping it up because it's important. A lot of people think, well, if it's important, should make money. And if it doesn't make money, then it ultimately can't be important. And I think that's foolhardy, but I think a lot of that is, but that's sort of the model of how you would do this. But, I will admit, my job is to figure out how to fix the Democratic Party in the media landscape that we have and get those people to invest in sort of the grassroots, some of the same people invest in the grassroots partisan things I want. I'd rather get them to do that than I would get them to build out the local media. But it's a complicated question about which of those things you want because, basically, how do you better inform people? Because better informed people vote for us more. So how do we get better informed people? And sort of how do we get better informed people? Sort of the relatively fastest and cheapest that we can. And even though one of the problems is that even though the things I start proposing have billion-dollar price tags, it still might be the fastest and cheapest way to get a more informed populace because you inform the populace by, you bring someone cookies, and then as you bring them cookies, there's a little bit of the news in the tin foil of the cookies. So to some degree, is that a better way than, here's your newspaper?
Well, actually, that's a great lead into sort of my last media question, which is, this kind of rise of independent media. I was surprised, and kind of the decline of traditional media, and I was surprised that you said earlier about that people are more informed if they listen to more or received more mainstream or traditional media. So how do you see, this kind of shift toward independent media? And I guess for creators like myself, what do you think we can do better to serve society and contribute to a more informed public?
So here's what the polling said. If it was newspapers writ large, it was became like a 70-30 pool. If it was traditional broadcast, it was 55-39 for Harris. If it was cable news, it was like 4 points for Democrat, or it was 4 points for Republicans. It was close. Basically the Google, online, and nothing were the places where Trump dominated. So I think that sort of I think most of the people who are doing this level who are now into listening to a podcast about these things, who are into a Substack, you know, I don't know if they still have a New York Times subscription, but the odds are pretty good they have a something subscription to the news that is not just that you're more supplemental than like replacement. It's when it becomes replacement that it becomes a challenge. But I don't think in most cases it's replacement. I think the, you know, I think it's I mean, I really think it's just keep doing it. And I think ultimately finding the one thing I think is particularly important is these ecosystems need to be promoting of each other. So the one thing the thing on the right has, and Donald Trump did a phenomenal, horrifyingly good job of this, is if you were on the right and you had an audience that was like in the hundreds of thousands, Trump would go on your show. And by Trump going on your show, he built up their branding, their ecosystem, you know, you know, you know, I will say if elected chair, I'll try and get you a member of Congress. I can't promise, and I'm probably not going to get elected chair, but just in saying in general that the way that you sort of build up the other side of either the other side of media or just even the side of let's learn more side is by platforming each other, treating each other, and sort of not sort of I think really clearly one of the major problems can be there is a lot of competition amongst sort of, my goal is to be where you get your political information from, whether that's Simon Rosenberg or the Pod Save guys or on down the line. My goal is that you get your information from me. And so I don't want to be, this is an old story. I don't know how true it is, but it's an old story I think is really important. So there were some New York members of Congress African American members of Congress, who helped Southerners do freedom rides and do voter registration drives. And then some of those people were like, oh, can we do a voter registration drive in your community? And they said, again, this may be apocryphal, but they said, no, the voters that we have now vote for me. So we don't need any new voters because the ones I have now vote for me. And if I have new ones, then who knows what they're going to do. So we don't need you to do a voter registration drive in my community. Thank you very much. It may be apocryphal, but the reason I mention that is that there's a lot of that mentality in the cross-pollinating democratic political slash even sort of nonpartisan intellectual podcasting world where it's like, you know, I'll bring on great guests, but I'm not going to, they're probably not going to put you on Freakonomics because maybe you're like, people might want to listen to you more than them. And so, but when you don't create that ecosystem whereby you're growing and building each other's audiences, that's more self referencing and building community and then than it is to be competitive. But it's, there is plenty to go around, but you have to have that mindset that there's plenty to go around and not have the mindset of I've got to get what I can out of this, ecosystem. And that can be challenging for people who really want to, how big they are in the pot, how big they are is more important. That's they want to be the guy or gal, but admittedly, mostly the guy.
Yeah, true. Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, and yeah, I need to take that on more myself. I have started to do some of more of that of like do some of that cross promotion with shows in similar spaces, which there aren't that many in this space either, so it's kind of hard. But so we've already talked about this a little bit. I wanted to shift over to if you can stay with us a while longer. The sort of some of the takeaways from the election. We're recording this on Inauguration Day. We kind of mentioned that. And since the election, I'm seeing a lot of feedback, and what I see is I really get a sense that listeners are struggling, and a lot of them are kind of wondering like how we got here. And we did the episode. You mentioned that you listened to it with some of the ideas people had. We already talked a little bit about the inflation one. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. I mean, I think the biggest one with regarding inflation is, and I think you talked about this a lot already, but just the idea of messaging it, and figuring out the right message there so that people didn't feel like they were unheard.
I think one of the major this is the biggest difference, I think, in my race between me and all of my other opponents or fellow candidates. I like them a lot. They'll all be good chairs. But I think everyone has this very first take view on the economy and inflation and the working class and losses there that doesn't take into account that on these issues, Joe Biden did as well as a person could do to a certain degree, certainly with the Congress that he had. On the issues of getting money into the hands of working people, he bailed out the Teamsters Union, pension fund, you know,
Chips
infrastructure
Act.
act, CHIPS Act, PACT Act, the Recovery Act massively prevented layoffs in state governments that people don't, if you go through it created huge amounts of inflation. If you sure go through everything in it and tell me what was the thing in it that people really hated and thought was like, a thing that should not have happened. Like there isn't even like a cash for clunkers or like Solyndra solar panel-y mistake fund thing that people were able to seize on. And I think again, those weren't overly important things either, but there just isn't any like, there's nothing even like that. So I think, and I was reading sort of your piece on like loneliness, I think those are very sort of deeply linked in that. So you basically have one tribe of people. They're sort of the red tribe, which is primarily white evangelical Christians. It's then it's some other white Christians, and then, that tribe has decided that they love and adore Donald Trump and think everything Donald Trump does is wonderful. And how dare you say anything bad about Donald Trump? And in the other blue, let the blue tribe, there is a constant drumbeat of you could have gotten us more, you should have gotten us more, there's more that we could have had, there's more that we want, we're only so happy. Why can't you do more for us? Why can't you accomplish that? Sometimes it's on really reasonable grounds. Sometimes it's on, some amount of petty nonsense grounds. But basically, hip hip hooray, gloom and doom. And so when you get to sort of the people who are left in the middle, my basic sense of it is you're gonna go with the rah-rahs. That you're gonna pick the rah-rahs. You're gonna want to be on the rah-rahs team. And if you want to be on the rah-rahs team, there are a lot of that's when you want to be on the rah-rahs team, and then you retroactively backfill with the issue du jour of what you want. And so one of the things that people, that struck me overwhelmingly is, in your show, they said, oh, the democracy concerns didn't resonate with people, and the economy concerns absolutely resonated with people. When they go to the national exit polls, 34% of voters said democracy was their number one issue. 32% said economy, right tied. When you ask people which way they voted, it was a flat-footed, basically, democracy voters voted for Harris at about 80-20, economy voters voted for Trump at about 80-20. So even the issue set became totally that you chose the issue set based on the tribe you were in. And it's sort of you know, and Republicans do a phenomenal job of pointing out any excess that the Democratic tribe pushes for. So if a slogan that will ring out for sort of ever, we're going to defund the police, which basically two members of maybe three members of the House on the Democratic side even entertained. One of them isn't there anymore, and the other two have stopped saying it. But that's an excess from the Democratic tribe. It gets attributed to the Democratic tribe. And then why won't I vote for a Democrat? Well, they want to defund the police. And to some degree, some people are afraid that if you confront that, you're basically, if you say, well, no, I absolutely don't want to do that, that means that what you're saying is cops, if you don't want to defund the police, you're saying cops can do no wrong. And obviously, there's a huge amount of difference between cops can do no wrong and defund the police. But sort of but that becomes the binary. And when that becomes the binary, more people will choose cops can do no wrong than defund the police. And the sort of cultural signifiers as you go down, the Republicans will pick at every one of ours. The Democrats are terrified to pick at the Republicans, which is the Republicans' core base is, a white evangelical majority on a white evangelical base that does want to, ban abortion, no exceptions, all 50 states, wants to get rid of gay marriage, wants to ban pornography, would move in the direction of sort of banning some amounts of heresy if they could. And Mike Johnson was the lead lawyer. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, was the lead lawyer for a lot of their causes. And, we are worried that if we state that stuff plainly, they'll say you're attacking religion. And since the country still is considerably majority religious, the Democrats will lose that, can't possibly win that fight. So we don't engage in that fight. But when you don't point to the excesses of the other side's tribe, then it's easier to slide in with, culturally fit in with the other tribe. And that sort of those, because when you really sort of boil it down, where the election was decided is 35% of the electorate said the economy was not so good. They voted for Trump by 6 points. 8% of the electorate disliked both of the candidates and they voted for Trump by 20 points. So it's what made those subsets decide the election, not. And I don't really believe that those subsets voted the way they did because of inflation or the economy. It's a deeper cultural disconnect problem. And that, deeper cultural disconnect problem, a lot of it also just comes that then you sort of overlay geography on it. And when you overlay geography on it, what you find is that it's really, really hard to be a blue person in a red area. So that once a place goes 2-1, the people who are the people who are in the one stop talking about it. Then the people who are less deeply committed to it stop feeling it. And then they want to vote with the majority of their community because people are mostly want to not be outliers, want to not be weird. And so one of the things is that if you then get to a point where you then go to the Democrats in the area that we're losing 75 to 25, the Democrats who are still Democrats have a risk of being weird because they're Democrats because they didn't want to cave to peer pressure. God bless them. I love them. They're my people. But it's very hard to go against sort of that peer pressure. Iowa in 2008, Iowa's my archetypal like democratic collapse state. In Iowa, Barack Obama lost 3 counties by more than 2-1. Kamala Harris lost 57 counties by more than 2-1 in Iowa. And, between Obama '08 and Harris 2024, the Democrats' policies really haven't changed very much. I mean, it is true now Democrats are for gay marriage, but so is the country. But beyond that, Democratic policies have not changed in 16 years in meaningful, dramatic ways. And sort of Biden's presidency on policy was not dramatically different than Obama's, except he may have let his regulators go after corporate actors in a slightly stronger way. And those corporate actors, particularly our friends in crypto, went to absolute insane war over it because, and maybe that, like a little, I think no one in this election is going to say, well, geez, Joe Biden lost the election because the Democrats lost the election because of crypto, because it seems like such a niche issue. But when you're playing trench warfare and you can take, you know, so basically, I'm the Trump campaign. We have evenly divided coalitions. My job is to create little wedges in every little spot. I want to create a little wedge and get off a little more. And, you know, the Democrats are not wedging back, you know, just such a degree that Trump could run a pro-choice campaign and take no guff from pro-lifers for it. None. But he basically said, I'm going to leave it up to the states, and you all know what's happening in all the votes in the states. So eventually everyone, wink, wink, eventually everywhere is going to be pro-choice. Don't worry about it. And lost no votes from pro-lifers on that because they didn't believe that he would, they basically said, oh, he's telling the lies he needs to tell, good for him. But, and one of the things sort of, at a weird messaging level is nobody in the Democratic Party, you have all this outside groups, but they're so command and controlled. No one in the Democratic Party is going to say, the best way to hit Trump on abortion would be to hit both Trump and Harris on abortion at the same time. Because if you hit both Trump and Harris on abortion to pro-life voters at the same time, they're not going to think, oh, this is the Democrats trying to get me to be anti-Trump because they're hitting Harris. But for pro-life voters that you weren't going to get, wasn't it? There's no reason to protect her favorables with those voters. But when you that's sort of the Jason Machiavellian school of these elections. But one of the things is that, ultimately to do that, you need, the big difference between, and I don't even know how much of the Musk stuff worked, but the big difference between the Democrats and Musk is the Democrats had the same number of billionaires. They didn't individually spend as much, but collectively they spent as much. But they gave to the same exact cautious consultant class to run the exact same sort of ads. Bill Gates did $50 million surreptitiously to Future Forward, and they ran those exact same ads. But Musk is like, I'm gonna throw my brain into figuring this out. I'm going to give, people are going to sign my petitions, and that's going to be how I gather data. I'm going to give out $1 million prizes. I'm going to make it so that if you go to Twitter at all, it's going to be nothing but my propaganda, and he really threw his whole brain into figuring this out. And, there were not as many corresponding Democratic billionaires who threw their whole brains into it. And one of the things interesting is like, there's an old, in Alabama, the Democrats in that Senate race back in 2017 did something like this, promoted the teetotaling views of some Roy Moore supporters to what they thought was the more heavy drinking Republican crowd. And then it came out, and then it was like disavowed because we can't do we can't do stuff like that. And, Jason Paul's Machiavellian school says that you have to. But those, to me, that's way more like, I'm not saying that like people were not upset about price of eggs, people not upset about economic conditions. One of the things I think about the economic conditions more than other people is the places that are dying are really bad. That death is not a 4-year problem. That death is a 50-year problem. But as places are slowly dying, their level of rage at things is higher. And, you know, but basically it's very hard if you're dying. I come to you and say, would you like immigrants? No. Would you like a college? No. Well, what do you want? I want to not die. Well, I can only bring you, the only way you can not die is if I bring you more people. No, no, I want the same people. I just don't want to die. It's like, well, but that the math doesn't math. That doesn't work. The math on that doesn't work. You can't save your communities without an influx of new people. What new people do you want? Well, why won't the kids stay home? Well, I know you'd love the kids to stay home, but they want, you know, they want, the opportunities that cities have, both in terms of job opportunities, but also in terms of like social opportunities. And so, they're not going to be content to marry Becky down the street. I know you'd like them to, but that's not a thing they necessarily want. And so, that story that to me is a bigger part of the economic story of democratic struggle more than just inflation. And sort of the first take view, I think, is not a perfect one.
Well, and there's definitely a disconnect with the inflation thing, as you were sort of hinting out before, that, supposedly everyone was so upset about inflation. Then we have like the biggest, Black Friday, and we have this huge, one of the biggest holiday seasons, for spending. So something's not, aligned there, right? There's some kind of misperception and disconnect.
The bottom line is that the the Democrats kept spending because the economy was fine. And in Black Friday, the Republicans started to spend because now Trump's going to fix everything. So that's fine. So so from a spending perspective, everybody's happy. The on a dime perception of the economy amongst Republicans is just amazing. Like if you've one sort of stat to find, that stat is amazing. They basically go from the economy is terrible to the economy is excellent because Donald Trump won, as if, and this gets into the sort of you know, I don't have time for media, but like the creation of Donald Trump by NBC as part of The Apprentice is the untold, horrifying story of how Donald Trump got to be Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump is Donald Trump because Donald Trump is perceived as the character that he was on The Apprentice. And if you go, you want to look, you want to know exactly how nonsense that is. There was not, to my knowledge, and then maybe there was one, none of the Apprentice contestants worked at the Trump organization, still worked at the Trump organization, and said, Donald Trump made me a millionaire. I love Donald Trump. Not one. And Mark Cuban said this best. A real billionaire is making millionaires. Where are Donald Trump's millionaires? But the NBC created Donald Trump genius is, still why everybody thinks he's the guy. That character would do a really good job on the economy. He must really know the economy. And the degree to which, that is still brutally imprinted on the minds of so many people, particularly who don't get, who don't pick up a newspaper. Oh, he's that economy guy because of the, that's not really the media, but it's enough the media that, you know, and they could have been like, here's every tape that we have, here's everything. It's all coming out. We are not going to sit on this. But like, I think Mark Brunette, I think is going to be the ambassador to somewhere or something.
Right.
Special advisor to England. He's something. So the bottom line is that they covered this up for him. And, is that the press? Is that not the press? I don't know. I know it's no good.
Yeah. So what you were a bunch of stuff you were saying a little earlier got me going on a couple of items, but so I'm gonna let's just kind of wrap up this idea of the election with one thing is that in your assessment, did the Democrats have bad data or did they just misinterpret the data they had?
I think to a large degree.
Or maybe something else entirely.
No, no, I want to answer the question. I think they had middling data. I think they always knew it was going to be really, really close. And I think one of the things that is one of the, again, one of the sort of, you know, the math was such that it was incredibly clear, incredibly early on in the evening that Donald Trump was going to win. And because it was incredibly clear early on in the evening that Donald Trump was going to win, it became sort of conceptual wisdom set sort of just started to set in that he won by a lot. But now that we have all of the data, he won by 230,000 votes across three states. The biggest, the state that he needed to win that he won by the least that he needed to win was Pennsylvania at 1.7%. So, that is like within the margin of what can be expected. I think the Democrats sort of, you know, there's a caution by nature that pervades Democratic consultant types that basically, you know, they're not inclined to throw Hail Marys. They're not inclined to throw long balls. They're really inclined to believe on their run game in a football perspective. And sort of, it's really hard for them to change out of that. One of the, you know, like in 16 with the Access Hollywood tape, they basically were like, everyone's seen it, everyone will see it, it won't fade, we don't have to do anything on it. And when they had the debate, Donald Trump showed up with, all of Bill Clinton's accusers and a woman who Hillary Clinton defended the person who attacked her. And like Hillary Clinton wasn't going to get into it with him on those issues because then she's going to point to these people and like the message will not be carried. And that sort of core caution, I think, is sort of core caution and belief in the sort of the value of the run game is such that if the data is anything close, they're not going to they're not going to do anything they're not going to do anything super risky because they don't want to do things that are risky. And therefore, sort of what does the data show before you do something like, really risky? And it was close enough that you could see why nobody wanted to do anything really risky. And, you know, sort of the, this gets really dicey, but one of the core things that exists is in communities that Democrats perceive as traditionally talk about as communities of color that are not African American. There's a belief that their more natural home is with Democrats. But there are a lot of issue sets on which their natural home is not necessarily with Democrats. Culturally, it's not always necessarily with Democrats. And sort of you know, always the assumption that second and third generation immigrants are going to have sympathy with current immigrants is something that a lot of people always think should happen and oftentimes does not happen. And in fact, sometimes second and third generation immigrants can have a tendency to be less to no zealot like a convert, no super, I know super American like a relatively new American because that's how I prove sort of I'm, you know, in with the, you know, in with the culture as it's going. And sort of the, you know, and not being, not wanting to be particularly associated with sort of what is seen as the Democrats' new base of, for it's not quite precise, but in the book I refer to white non-Christians as in it was about 15% of the electorate and sort of a core new base for the Democratic Party. And sort of those communities are not particularly well suited to the positions of, you know, and that's where a huge amount of like that is where a lot of woke comes from. Is it started obviously in the African American community directly affected by police brutality, but sort of it morphed into sort of an overall ideology that started to include, you know, things that people are not super keen on. And basically, if you get any pushback, the assumption is sort of shout like, you know, you know, if you have questions, you push back and you start saying, well, then you know, you want to start canceling people for opinions that are like, which they would just basically canceling people for positions that it's possible that 60% of Americans just think are normal is not a winning message of a political party. And I want to be very clear, it's never Democratic Party officials. It's never Democratic elected officials. It's never even party apparatus. It's rarely party statements. It's sort of a group of people who, you know, exist outside the party. A lot of them would tell you they have no love for the Democratic Party, but that's who Fox News says we are. And since we don't want to be like in a flame war with a certain amount of people on the internet, we're not picking fights with people who you know push a set of issues that makes it seem like we're outside of the mainstream.
Hmm.
And obviously I'm in that 15%, so it's not um but sort of I can see how that 15% dominating a lot of the cultural conversation is a very serious challenge.
So one other thing I wanted to talk about from that episode on the election was, I don't know if you remember this part with Andrew Van Horn. It was something I hadn't really heard before, or I hadn't really thought about that much. And he was talking about how speaking of Democrats, they're campaigning as though they're the revolution, but you're not the revolution anymore. You're the establishment, and kind of talking about that, like how does you know, how can Democrats sort of convince people to vote for them as the establishment instead of trying to sell this progressive revolutionary message.
Well, basically, I don't think the Democrats ran on a progressive revolutionary message. What I think he was getting at a little bit is when you're
Well, they
talking
kind of
about
ran as a change party, or at least the electorate seemed to be wanting change, and Democrats seem to be trying to run also on a change party. But I don't know. Maybe that's not what he meant exactly.
is what he sort of the cultural thing that he referenced was the Handmaid's Tale. And then basically the idea is that, you know, the Democrats are trying to run against a Republican imposition of Handmaid's Tale values. And the basic idea would be you're in charge. Why do you think that's a threat? You're in charge. You should be able to beat that threat without the need to scare us about it. I think is sort of somewhat true in the messaging, but I also think it's the case that that issue set is actually one on which the Democrats had to figure out how to message on it smarter, but still need to message on it a lot because I think that it's the sort of the area on which the Republicans can tend to be the most vulnerable. So I don't, you know, I think it's also the case that sort of the, you know, and this is one of pivoting all the way back to one of my main themes of the campaign, but the number one message that people got from Democrats for sure is the Democratic Party would like $5, please, for this candidate, that candidate, or any other candidate. In my inbox, that was overwhelmingly the communication was, I need money, I need money, I need money, I need money, I need
I think
money.
I'd have two of those texts I just got today.
Sure you do. And I will bet dollars to donuts, I'm gonna, make a little, dollars to donuts, they make outrageous claims.
Oh yeah, big
They
surprise.
were making more outrageous claims probably before Trump took over. They were promising that you'd get four new Supreme Court justices. And one of the things I talked about that people probably don't know is that almost all of the worst offenders come from our clients of one particular consulting firm, Mothership Strategies. And that's basically what they do is they were shunned by a lot of the they were shunned by a lot of the actual candidates. And so what they did was go to find outside groups, and whether the outside groups, some of them do some stuff that's not just them. Sometimes I'm worried that literally they just exist to raise money to put back into the coffers to raise more money and are not effective. But the bottom line is that you say, Democrats aren't communicating the right message. But I think that if you're not talking about if you're not really talking about paid advertisements, the Democrats don't really have any message because all communication channels are flooded with requests for donations. And, you can say sort of, well, get on the sites, be on TikTok, be on this, post this, post this, post this. But the problem is traditional party messaging stuff is just not going to super duper mega work when it comes to. So that is what I, so, that is where I think the messaging thing falls down. It's not a matter of sort of, and basically, at the same time, it's like the same thing is that your guy is that it was totally completely the case that everybody bought in Trump's economy was better than in Biden's. Uniform agreement on that, not necessarily true, certainly very close. And, you know, if you run on your accomplishments, you're disrespecting the voters. So if you can't run on your accomplishments, you have to run on fear of the other guys. And Handmaid's Tale is as good a way to make people afraid as anything. So I don't really know, like, how do you basically, when trying to square all these disparate circles, I kind of think that in the 107 days that the Harris campaign had, they kind of did the best they absolutely possibly could have. Are there nitpicky things I might, little chisel here, little chisel there? Sure. But basically, the core belief that the Trump economy was better than the Biden economy was built for 3 years, brick by right-wing media, then being adopted by traditional media, and then being in the zeitgeist across everyone. And sort of one of the things I talk about a lot, and they're going to come crashing into each other now, but you have this Trump split screen with the voters that we lost. So for Democrats, we look at all the stuff that happened in the Trump term and we're like, how could you possibly want to go back to that? And the bottom line is what the voters who we lost in the split screen says is, we don't know anything about Ukraine. We don't know anything about shithole countries. Sorry if we don't know anything about any of that stuff. We don't know anything about Mueller. What we know is you said things were going to be terrible. Everything kept humming along. everything was basically fine until the pandemic, which wasn't his fault. And anyway, you guys wanted to impose all these public health measures, which were mostly about, which had the side effect of making life much better for people who could be remote workers and much worse for people who couldn't be remote workers. And so, all of that gets all sort of tied up together. And, then the media says that that's just true. And so I'll take those first 3 years of Trump. Thank you very much. All the stuff you guys are complaining about is just doesn't matter to me. And basically, and I don't really think that the Democrats' message should be, well, it really should. I think it should have, the one thing that, I know when I go off on messaging, one of the things that drives me nuts, and to some degree, Democrats are still doing it, is Trump had budgets that didn't pass. That's what he proposed. Instead of talking about those budgets, we talked about Project 2025. And in Project 2025, all Trump said was, that's not me. I'm not doing that. I don't like it. I like some of it. I don't like some of it. Was he lying? Of course he was lying. But the bottom line is, whether he was lying or not, there weren't enough fingerprints that you were like, that's his. But the budgets he proposed were his. And there was enough in that to go after. This is what you said you wanted to do. We stopped you. If
Right.
you get in
Instead, the
power
story
again,
became, is he lying about Project 2025 association or not? Right.
yes. I'm saying is the bottom line is that if you want to make the case that this is what he's going to do, this is what he's going to do, this is what he wanted to do, that we stopped. We stopped all this. He would have done it, but we stopped it. And so we stopped it, but we don't have the confidence that if we get in again, we're going to be able to stop it. So because don't have the confidence that we're going to be able to stop it, you can't put him back in, because he'll do all these. And this is the stuff that he wanted to do, that he said he wanted to do, not the stuff that we said that he said that he wanted to do. This is the stuff anyway.
Well, and there was like Agenda 47 too. That was on his website. The stuff he said, where there was enough there we could talk about too. You could just ignore Project 2025. There was enough in just Agenda 47, which was on his website. He can't distance himself from it.
Yeah, no, I agree. But even the Project 47, the point is that all of that was designed to be dumb soundbitey things. So he was not going to say, I want to cut Medicare, or I'm going to do this.
No.
In the budgets, he did all of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I know I've really kept you a lot longer than we talked about, but I was going to finish with one thing. I talked in the beginning about how, a lot of people are struggling right now. They're like almost in shock about about the election result, and they're feeling discouraged. And like there's nothing they can really do to make a difference. I've seen that kind of sentiment a lot. Now, you've kind of set a high bar for the rest of us in terms of engagement as a strategist and now as a candidate for DNC chair. And we're obviously not all going to be able to go that far. So what advice would you give the average person, who feels pretty disheartened, but how can they maybe find meaningful ways to re-engage?
So I would say find a Substack that you like and read it. Sort of, there are some don't immediately have like, maybe I'll get back to you with recommendations. I don't want to like just start throwing out names, but just find one Substack that you like and read it. I would say finding a way to, engage in your local level with something that matters to you all, is a good plan. Um, you know, I would think I would probably encourage like reading some foreign news, even the foreign news that is about us. So like the BBC, what the BBC says about us is probably more likely to be accurate and less likely to be this gotcha-y, because they're not as emotionally invested in it. Um, and that's that's the place to start, is just, you know, and then, obviously, one guy I absolutely love on these things, is Timothy Snyder from Yale. And it's really important that you don't obey in advance. That's one of the most, because a lot of power that sort of more autocratic people gain is given to them by you being sort of I don't want to get in trouble, so I'll just start not. But I would not do that. And just then it's what, you know, and then it's just what feels right to you, and don't do more than what feels right to you, and don't make people try and make you do more than what feels right to you, but also don't, but also do the things that feel right to you. That would be my, that would be my advice.
Well, I think that's great. Yeah, it's good advice. I appreciate it. Jason Paul, thank you so much for giving
No,
us
it
so
was
much
a
of your
great
time.
absolutely, it was a great conversation. I got into this because these ideas are really important, and we need to think through them, and we need to think through them hard. And I really appreciate people who want to engage in that. And I will definitely, once this goes up, share it around to on my socials in the hopes that other people will, hear about you guys. And I agree that it's that you both have to be outraged all the time, and it also becomes like pointless.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I'll definitely look forward to some of those links. I'll make sure we have all the links in the show notes for everybody. So again, thank you so much. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.